It is difficult to put into words what I suffered, the longing that seemed to be tearing my heart out by the roots, the dreadful sense of being alone in an empty universe, the agonies that thrilled through me as if the blood were running ice cold in my veins, the disgust with living, the impossibility of dying. Shakespeare himself never described this torture, but he counts it among the terrible of all evils of existence. I had stopped composing. My mind seemed to become feebler as my feelings grew more intense. I did nothing. One power was left me: to suffer. I want to take a brief moment to thank today's sponsor, Babbel. As you know, I've been learning Spanish since late last year, but I decided to add to the challenge by trying out French. My reasons for trying to learn new languages is honestly just rooted in vanity by this point. I think it's hot to be able to speak more than one language. Fall also makes for the perfect studying vibe. You can light a candle, open a window, eat some pumpkin pie, and cozy up with your Babbel app. With lessons designed by real language teachers, Babbel is scientifically proven to get you speaking in your target language within just 3 weeks. And the lessons go way beyond simple phrases like apple or yellow. Their goal is to get you constructing sentences, okay? They teach you how to speak to real people out in the real world about an array of topics, from travel to business to relationships. It's really no wonder why Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world. You can get 60% off your subscription by visiting my link in the description or scanning the QR. And make sure to let me know in the comments what language you're excited to learn this fall. Merci, Babbel. Gracias por patrocino este video. I'm not making the página mistake again. Página, not página. Página. Bienvenidos a mi página. Wouldn't it be funny if absolutely everything I just said was incorrect? Over my cold dead body. The Romantic poets of the 18th and 19th century thought that to be melancholic was to be artistically authentic. So much so that profound themes of death, sadness, grief, and the like can be found in a great number of classics from that time. For the Romantic, their artistic existence was defined by these larger-than-life experiences. They believed that blood from fallen soldiers would soak into the ground and spring forth as flowers, that Mother Nature herself radiates strength and malevolence. Not religious charity, Coleridge, you fucking wet paper-toweled miscreant. To be romantic was to have a touch of madness, as Jamison puts it. It was to be swept by the muses in their quality of genius. But the idea of the tortured yet wildly passionate artist stretches back even further than the Romantics. Aristotle once wondered why people who excelled in creative work, people like philosophers, poets, and artists, were touched by unfathomable sadness. And in Plato's book Phaedrus, Socrates says that madness comes from God, whereas sober sense is merely human. If a man comes to the door of poetry untouched by the madness of the muses, believing that technique alone will make him a good poet, he and his sane compositions never reach perfection, but are utterly eclipsed by the performances of the madman. This promotion of the tortured artist implies that it isn't necessarily skill, intuition, or even practice that makes the artist. It's the touch of fine madness or possession by the muses. Now, madness varies in meaning. I've noticed throughout my research that scholars sometimes use mad when they really mean eccentric or unconventional. Perhaps the person they're referring to isn't mentally ill per se. Perhaps they just have a different way of doing things, or they're considered wild or quirky. The definition of madness I'm most interested in, however, and the one most pertinent to the topic of the tortured artist, is the denotation. Oxford Languages defines madness as the state of being mentally ill, especially severely. Likewise, the tortured artist is usually defined by their unhappiness. They tend to channel this misery into their work, creating marvelous and introspective pieces despite their affliction. Kate Devine notes that creators of this caliber are also exemplified by disheveled unkemptness, outlandish, unpredictable behavior, eccentricism, isolation, and hunger, metaphorically and literal. All of this culminates to form the picture of a successful artist, not necessarily monetarily, but productively, morosely. It is under this bad star that the conception of the mentally ill artist was born. Some argue that there's an inherent connection between madness and the arts. The splatters of Pollock, the prose of Woolf, all of it is an indication of serious creators who, even while tortured by their own minds, still create something worthwhile, something provocative. Now, if I could, I would spray this trope with hairspray and light a match. As Hamlet once said of his Uncle Claudius in Act 1, Scene 5, I want that bitch dead. Tonight. There are many layers of the tortured artist trope that I simply do not vibe with. Nestled within one layer, you have the suggestion that serious art is most often made by tortured artists. In this vein, we tend to denigrate things that are popular or entertainment-based in favor of more emotional, stricken work. The suffering that accompanies such torture is what makes art real. This leads to two potential roadblocks: the romanticization of overworking or putting stress on one's body to create respectable work, and the romanticization of madness, or in less stigmatizing terms, mental illness. We often hear about the afflictions of such artists like Vincent van Gogh, how he drank yellow paint because he wanted to be happy, how he created all of these wonderful artworks despite of or because of his mental anguish. These romantic ponderings of what makes art serious and what makes serious art possible in the first place is now the 20 minutes, half an hour. There's traffic on our stage, the which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, my toil shall strive to mend. There's personal anguish everywhere. We can't dodge it. John Berryman, in his mad way, keeps talking about something evil stalking us poets. That's a bad way to talk, but there's some truth to it. These are the words of Robert Lowell, written in a 1966 letter to Philip Booth. The letter describes his friend John's apparent sadness, which became clear to Lowell shortly before penning these words. Lowell himself, whom I know nothing about, I hope he isn't getting cancelled, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 1949. Earlier that year, he had seemed to crack up after accusing the director of his writer's retreat of being a communist sympathizer. He fell into numerous deep depressions, made impulsive decisions, and those closest to him confessed in letters that they thought he had gone mad. As someone diagnosed with bipolar 2, I've noticed that a lot of media portrayals like to focus on violence and murder when it comes to this disorder, on how it allegedly makes people into killers, into tormentors, or stalkers. Not a lot of nuance is afforded to mental illnesses, especially those that are excluded from general conversations of mental health. Illnesses like personality disorders, schizophrenia, and so forth. So I was rather surprised when I came upon Redfield Jamison's book, Touched with Fire, Manic Depressive Illness, and the Artistic Temperament. Because not only are disorders like bipolar excluded from general conversations of mental health, they're also excluded from the conversation of the tortured artist. Jamison argues for much of the book that there seems to be similarities between artistic temperament and bipolar temperament. Both are supposedly marked by fierce energy, high mood, a sense of the visionary and the grand, as well as darker moods, grimmer energies, and, occasionally, bouts of madness. Jamison's novel is, of course, not perfect. There's a high possibility that the language used is stigmatizing and outdated. It was written in the 90s. That was like a millennium ago for some of you. It was a millennium ago for me. But I think Jamison's novel sets a stable foundation for the analysis of this supposed connection between mental anguish and creativity that came to form the tortured artist trope. This connection first became the subject of notable consideration in 1812 by Professor Benjamin Rush. Don't know him, hope he's not getting canceled. The flurry of studies that followed were, as Jamison noted, anecdotal but suggestive. Biographies of poets, artists, writers, and the like were closely examined for signs of mental illness, and it was through this type of study that scholars would argue a link between madness and the arts. Dr. Colin Martindale analyzed 21 English poets born between the 17th and 19th centuries, as well as 21 French poets born between the 18th and 20th centuries. They concluded that over 50% of the English poets and 40% of the French poets had a history of significant psychopathology. 1 in 7 poets had been institutionalized in an asylum or had suffered from severe, recurring, or unmistakable symptoms like hallucinations or delusions. Jamison herself conducted a few studies, with the first sampling all major British and Irish poets born within a century. She concluded that, quote, 6 were committed to lunatic asylums or madhouses, a rate easily 20 times that of the general population living during the same time period. More than 1/2 of the poets showed strong evidence of mood disorders, and more than 1 out of 3 of the poets seemed likely to have suffered from manic depression. These poets included William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley, all of whom had happened to peak during the Romantic period. Other artists thought to display symptoms of mental illness, specifically bipolar disorder, include Edgar Allan Poe, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Mary Shelley, Sylvia Plath, Leo Tolstoy, and Anne Sexton. I want to make it clear that I am no doctor, I am barely a person, and I don't think it's possible to speculate on people we have never met. Although some of the people on this list have been diagnosed, a lot of the artists included in the book and on various tortured artist lists are considered mentally ill on pure speculation. I don't think we'll ever really know for sure if every single one had a mental illness or if there were other factors causing their distress. Jamison argues that the tortured artist trope is so normalized within our culture that it's hard to distinguish fact from fiction, reality from mere expectation. This suggests the possibility that artists, acting upon a perceived duty, behave in a way that is expected of them, rather than a way that is organic to their personality. It seems impossible, this expectation, but it's a lot more common than you think, considering the culture surrounding eccentric artistry. Sorry, I just got a text. Robert Lowell, for instance, had a number of public manic episodes. Those who witnessed these episodes, like his friends and his colleagues, never anticipated that he needed medical attention for this behavior. Jamison notes that some members of the faculty found him excitable and talkative during this period, but he was just behaving as some of them hoped a famous poet would behave. They even went as far as rebuking his wife when she suggested that Lowell was ill. What to her was mad was to them another mark of his genius. Though this information is in fact anecdotal, it does seem to highlight that unmistakable commonality questioned thousands of years ago by Greek philosophers. These biographical studies suggest that a lot of poets, writers, and painters do seem to suffer from some sort of sadness, some sort of strife. The question is it justifiable to say that to be an artist is to be mad? Does correlation imply causation? Well, careful now, we're approaching a ledge. Though Jamison does argue from the perspective of positive and productive madness granted by bipolar disorder, she is also steadfast in her assertion that labeling as manic depressive anyone who is unusually creative, accomplished, energetic, intense, moody, or eccentric both diminishes the notion of individuality within the arts and trivializes a very serious, often deadly illness. So, semi-slay. But if the correlation is a mere incident, how do we explain its abundance? One attempt involves the argument that artists are just more sensitive to life and the experiences of life than other people. Therefore, they are more sensitive to their own mood states, end quote, and may articulate it more than the general population. Far more stigmatizing rebuttals try to persuade by saying,
look, none of those great artists were ever mentally ill in the first place. Look, I know they wrote a 40-page thesis of why they would never be happy no matter whatever, but mentally ill people can't create good art. Do you think a depressed person could do this?
Me when I. Within the mentally ill people don't deserve talent argument resides the belief that true artistry is defined by balanced faculties. Charles Lamb in The Sanity of True Genius argues, it is impossible for the mind to conceive a mad Shakespeare. The greatness of wit, by which the poetic talent is here chiefly to be understood, manifests itself in the admirable balance of all faculties. Me when I. This was a very popular argument around the tail end of the Romantic era. People suffered through a century of ode to Grecian urns and nightingales and were sick and tired. They had enough. They began to argue that to have balanced artwork, one must have a balanced mind. Therefore, being touched by madness meant that you weren't able to create good art. You see that? Ableism kills. It's my belief that mental illness doesn't take away from one's ability to create compelling art. It may make it harder, which we'll get into, but it doesn't mean it kills the ability for good. As Kate Devine notes, the relationship between art and madness is intimate and complicated. There's no right answer when it comes to the connection between madness and artistry. Except for mine, because I'm always right. I don't think there's a real connection. There just doesn't seem to be enough evidence. I will say, however, that it's easy to believe in the pattern. There are a lot of great artists who seem to have been struggling with something bigger than them, something bigger than their art. But the explanations are endless. It could be that art is seen as a form of therapy, and people who are struggling may feel that art is the best avenue of expressing or distracting themselves. Maybe artists, writers especially, do happen to lucidly articulate their emotions, making it seem like they're more prone to madness than the general population, when really that's not the case. Or maybe mentally ill people are everywhere, not just in stigmatized portrayals on the TV. We can be friends, artists, family, or partners. You can probably find a large portion of mentally ill people working in any job, and that doesn't mean there's a correlation. You know, besides capitalism being depressing and everything, regardless of the answer, the damage has already been done. There's a resounding belief in the tortured artist trope, one that has convinced us, just as it did the Romantics, that to be melancholic, to be afflicted, is to be authentic in your artistry. As Vincent van Gogh wrote, "The more I am spent, ill, a broken pitcher, by so much more am I an artist, a creative artist." What defines serious art? That's what I would ask if I didn't know shit about elitism. What defines serious exclusion? Good old segregation. The history of the word serious in relation to art comes with some concerning connotations. The editor's note of Edward Sankowski's Serious Art and Autonomy explains that the word serious is used most often in making distinctions between high art, serious, and popular art, non-serious. We can see this distinction clearly in Ryan J. Napier's work, where they compare the seriousness of Warhol's Campbell soup cans to that of, I can't pronounce that, Jan Matejko's Stanks. I'm not gonna keep butchering it like that. Whereas Jan's artwork creates an intelligent, thought-provoking conversation about politics and jesters sitting in anguish in front of their computers, Warhol's art is seriously unserious. It's silly, it's stimulating, rousing. Pretty colors go brr. Napier argues that Campbell Soup Cans is made for too wide of an audience, composed of too ordinary and accessible an object, and is created using community rather than isolation. Therefore, the work comes off as gimmicky, and it cannot be considered serious. According to Napier, serious art is defined by quality artworks that cause reevaluation and or personal reflection on accepted political, cultural, or communal rules. It must have emotional depth, passion, contemplation, and, most importantly, chaos. Napier asks the question, can a depressed person make this? And we're supposed to clap. Yes, they can make that. Art that we're supposed to take serious is steeped in upheaval, soaked in strife, and marinated in chaos. Expression through creation is at its most piercing when an artist is not at peace with the world. Some degree of pain, whether it be mental, physical, or spiritual, must be endured to create serious art. Goer, whom Napier bases a large portion of their paper's argument on, adds on to this concept by stating,
"As is sometimes said, no really serious art is produced under happy circumstance, or in an atmosphere of non-constraint."
So not slay. The argument that serious art has to come from mental anguish only furthers the expectation of the tortured artist trope. Though you can argue that these are just the silly little thoughts of a few silly little academics, they're not pulling from a dry well. I've come across a lot in my time on the internet, and emotional elitism is a very prevalent concept. People tend to bash things like pop music or other entertainment-based media as vapid. This was especially true when I was a baby emo in 2013 to 2014. I brought into the widely accepted idea that pop music was pointless, that it had no substance, that the true, real music was made by some dude in the Midwest crying about his failed dreams and train tracks. For a long time, it wasn't that you just didn't like pop music, it was that it was gimmicky, unserious. It embodied the enemy of authentic and provocative art.
Okay, so don't kill me, but this kind of reminds me of Lana Del Rey's Question for the Culture. Like, whereas her music is feeling beautiful and being embodied by being in love and all of that, where she talks about more sad topics, and artists like Doja Cat, Ariana, Camila, Cardi B, they have more happy songs, more ass-shaking songs, things like that, and they're considered artists that talk about fucking and cheating and wearing no clothes. I think this is what I mean when I say that those earlier academics weren't drawing from a dry well. There's like a long history of people denigrating art that isn't sort of emotionally deep. And we can see that with Lana Del Rey, but we can also see that with Napier's argument about Warhol.
For art, this level of condescension is pervasive, and I believe it builds an expectation for artists who believe they need to draw from a well of tragedy in order to create something that matters in an elitist community. This expectation of serious art coming from tension could lead to a romanticism of tragedy. From an artist's viewpoint, tragedy is glamorized because it could be channeled into more art. We fail to challenge the pure futility of such pain because we think that to create respectable work, you have to unravel your guts for the rest of the world to see. But what we don't consider is, who cleans it all up after? Who makes the incision? And how do you work through all that blood? Robert Lowell once described mania as a magical orange grove in a nightmare. Though it sounds tempting, it's intertwined with fear, chaos, self-hatred. It's a clever metaphor for the way we romanticize the truly debilitating reality of mental illnesses, how we believe that somehow real or serious artists can work through anguish, through crack-ups, through stress, to create purpose. This can be found at play in Jamison's novel as she explains the ideal artistic cycle of someone living with bipolar disorder.
While many ideas may be generated during the mildly manic states, much of the structuring, editing, and fine-tuning of artistic work is carried out during normal or mildly depressed periods.
Whereas it's generally believed that mania or hypomania aids in productivity or grand thought processes, depression is thought to be used for rumination and articulation. It seeks to make sense of those discombobulated thoughts.
Depression prunes and sculpts, Jamison argues. It also ruminates and ponders and ultimately subdues and focuses thought. It allows structuring at a detailed level of the more expansive patterns woven during hypomania.
Emil Kraepelin, a scholar of the 20th century, also uncovered a supposed benefit of being an artist with bipolar disorder.
The volitional excitement which accompanies the disease may under certain circumstances set free powers which otherwise are constrained by all kinds of inhibition. Artistic activity, namely, may, by the untroubled surrender to momentary fancies or moods, experience a certain furtherance.
This romanticized look at art and mental illness is as every part of the tortured artist as the concept of serious artistic guidelines. In order to create serious art, as we've seen, you must draw from a well of mental anguish, of torture, of depression. But when we work only from this angle, when we strengthen only this narrative, we're doing a great disservice to the detrimental realities of mental illness. We're romanticizing something that harms us. Romanticization of illness isn't new. Emily Dunn explains in their 2017 thesis that in the Victorian era, people would appropriate the symptoms of tuberculosis because they thought it had a certain je ne sais quoi, a tragically lovely quality to it. Those affected by the sickness were frail, thin, and sickly pale. You know, the image of true beauty. So in order to present themselves as more charming, people of the time would emulate these characteristics, even if they weren't sick. Mental illness is romanticized in the same way. I want to be careful about implying that people fake mental illnesses in order to seem cool. While it's a very popular argument on social media, I also think it can be a dangerous one. There are certain intersections of class, culture, and race that makes seeking a professional diagnosis hard. If you assume one person is faking based on how they present symptoms, how long until you think everyone who isn't professionally diagnosed is faking? But anywho, I think we romanticize mental illness in the same way as tuberculosis was romanticized, in the way that we see it as something tragically beautiful, something that even through its struggles makes us emotionally deep. Donnie Chang notes how, as a 13-year-old, she was often introduced to romanticized images on websites like Tumblr, images that featured various types of self-harm, overlaid with poetry or deep quotes about depression. I also saw a lot of that sort of content on Tumblr when I was around that age, and it was something that I consumed a lot of at the time because it was so relatable to my own mental anguish. While I absolutely agree that this can be a form of self-expression and artistic therapy, it can also be detrimental to internalize. People don't commit suicide because they're angels looking for a way back home. They do it because there's something in their life causing them so much anguish that they can't bear to live through it. Depression isn't a tragically beautiful affliction that can fit into aesthetic gift sets on a pale grunge blog. It's unbrushed teeth, unwashed bodies, isolation, and fear. It's looking at things you once loved and not being able to conjure up a feeling for them, positive or negative. Internalizing these romantic ideas is dangerous because it upholds stigma and misinformation. Just as Robert Lowell's friends and colleagues ignored his manic behavior in favor of romanticizing it alongside his artistry, others may normalize symptoms of mental illness and not get help for themselves or others because they fear that it'll smite their artistic genius. This in turn convinces us to absorb dangerous stereotypes or tropes like that of the tortured artist, where we believe that our suffering is beautiful, that we create the best when we're in anguish, that even though we can't imagine our own futures, at least we're being productive or being respectable in our artistry. Glamorization skews our understanding of the complexity of mental illness. As Lowell notes, depression is no gift from the muse. Even though I can attest to the fact that yes, I do conceive of grand ideas during my hypomanic episodes, they're not brilliant. Oftentimes, when I come out of an episode, I have to sweep those ideas under the rug because they're just not conceivable. I buy all of these things because I think of some ridiculous concept on a whim, and then I have to deal with the fact that I brought it for nothing. I can't use it. It's not as grand as I thought in my head when I was hypomanic, and I wasted money that I just didn't have. The idea that depression scopes or lends rationality to the hypomanic mind also fails to find reality, at least for me, because do you know how hard it was for me to write this script? I'm just a silly little jester making silly little ironic videos, and God decided to smite me with a depressive episode just as I sat down to research for this. God making it was like pulling teeth too. My depression makes me self-critical, agitated, and confused. Nothing I wrote made sense, and everything I did manage to write sounded silly. I can't personally create in either one of my cycles because I'm either too outlandish or too reclusive. Now, that isn't to say that no one can create while mentally ill, mind you. As Devin explained earlier, being an artist while being mentally ill is complex and intimate. It's not the same for all of us. I can't buy into the tortured artist trope because it's unsustainable for my life. It's not beautiful or a gift from the muses. It's frustrating. I would much rather be free of a mental illness than be a tortured artist. If it meant that I made mediocre art because I was finally happy, then so be it. The more I am spent ill, a broken picture, the less I am an artist, an uncreative artist, because I cannot pour from something so empty. Recovery and patience with oneself is what the tortured artist ignores to a detriment. While in recovery at St. Remy, Vincent van Gogh completed 150 paintings. It's noted by both Dusan Nikolic and the Van Gogh Art Museum that he couldn't paint during his various attacks, and he essentially wasn't allowed to by the care staff. That didn't mean he didn't have the urge, it just meant that when he was well enough, he would dive back into the one thing that made sense to him, that gave him clarity, and that was art. And I think this can be true for a lot of people who find therapy through art. It doesn't mean that there's a distinct causation between mental illness and creativity, but as Jamison notes, art can be extremely interpersonal. It can be used to relate to others, or it can be used to relate back to yourself when you feel cut off from your own life. That could very well be what Vincent van Gogh meant about being a broken picture. The more he is ill, the more he has to be an artist. It's cathartic. It's curative, but it's not the bar. Viewing art as therapy is not the same as viewing the need for therapy as the prerequisite of making good art. Does that make any sense, or am I just talking? Van Gogh's mental illness didn't make him a great artist. It scared him. It scared him so much that he didn't think he could live with it anymore. Sometimes depression is just depression, not a tool, not a weapon, not a pair of angel wings to finally take us home.
I see at last that all the knowledge I wrung from the darkness is worthless as ignorance. Nothing comes from nothing. The darkness from the darkness. Pain comes from darkness, and we call it wisdom. It is pain,
and we must treat it with the full complexity it treats us. The terror, the anguish, the cold reality. It will not hold back. It will not dress itself up and call itself a savior. Neither should we. Or it's not that deep, I don't know. Nothing really matters on this earth. Go subscribe to my second channel, Patreon in the description, and make sure to check out Babbel so they'll keep giving me Babbel money. Love you. Stay safe out there. Damn, I hit that kind of hard. Bye.